Hello and welcome back to Pop Culture Graveyard. I am Hollis, and this week I'm going to be focusing on the early years of the Psychedelic Furs. We're talking 1980 through 1987. That's my Psychedelic Furs, and the period during which I totally loved this band. The Psychedelic Furs have a great sound, but for me, what keeps me coming back is Richard Butler's voice. If a cigarette could sing, it would sound like Richard Butler, owning a voice as unique and iconic as that of Mark Bolan, Ian Curtis, or Perry Farrell. I don't think Richard Butler ever gets enough credit as a vocalist, so hopefully this episode will set things right. So break out your hair gel, mousse, or hairspray as I take you through the early 80s albums of the Psychedelic Furs. Love my way. Smoker's cough. Before we get started, I just want to thank my latest patron. Thank you, Paul. You are cooler than cool, and I'm very grateful for your patronage, Mr. Warham. If you're enjoying the content I'm bringing you and would like to help support the show, please consider joining my Patreon. It's at patreon.com/popculturegraveyard. And thanks. In 1980, the Psychedelic Furs released The Psychedelic Furs, partially produced by Steve Lillywhite and partially produced by Martin Hannett. This self-titled debut album is surprisingly self-assured, and it contains some of my favorite Psychedelic Furs songs. Full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of saxophones in rock music. Don't get me wrong, I love saxophone in X-Ray Specs, or in The Stooges, or Rob Lowe in St. Elmo's Fire, but normally, I'm not a big sax guy. That goes right out the window with the Psychedelic Furs. They have mastered the art of melancholy saxophone, and it brings a very necessary element to their sound. My favorite tracks on this album are as follows. India, which leads off the album, and is as relentless a track as the Furs have ever recorded. Sister Europe and Susan's Strange are the best tracks that Bauhaus never recorded. The track Fall is a top 3 all-time favorite Psychedelic Furs song for me. Richard Butler's hectic vocals totally drive this infectious track, and side 2's dance-friendly Pulse is a track I would play in most of my DJ sets, and I defy you not to like it. This is a very unique album, and it sort of defies classification. It's got a foot in many genres at once, and that's one of the great things about this album. And nothing about this album would point to the mainstream success that they would have later on. In 1981, the band released Talk, Talk, Talk. Steve Lillywhite returns to produce this album by himself, and he did a wonderful job of coalescing the sound that we would come to recognize as the Psychedelic Furs. One of my favorite tracks on this album, of course, is Pretty in Pink, which kicks off this album with flair. And it's one of the best side A's track ones ever. And the Pretty in Pink on this album is far superior to the re-recorded version that would wind up on the 1986 soundtrack to Pretty in Pink the film. Speaking of which, how the hell don't you kick off the soundtrack with the title track Pretty in Pink? Granted, OMD's song is more central to the movie itself, coming as it does at the end of the film, but I still don't get how you don't kick off this soundtrack with Pretty in Pink. Incidentally, there is a note on the back of this soundtrack that reads, "The music in Pretty in Pink was not an afterthought. The tracks on this album and in this film are there because Howie Dutch and I believe in the artists, respect the artists, and are proud to be in league with them. John Hughes." John Hughes heard the song, the story goes, by a Molly Ringwald who brought it to him and said they should base a movie on it. I believe it was actually Keith Forsey who had written the song Don't You Forget About Me already for John Hughes, and he was producing the Furs at the time. No matter who introduced the idea to John Hughes, it acted as the creative springboard for him to write a film titled Pretty in Pink. John Hughes took that literally, and in the film Andy wears a pink dress, but in the far superior original 1981 version, Pretty in Pink alludes to the character in the song being naked, as she usually is, as she builds her reputation for being with an awful lot of men. I feel it's a rather depressing song, yet it somehow sounds uplifting, and that gives the song an awful lot of its power. Pretty in Pink aside, this is a very strong album, and to anyone who was cool back then, love this album. Dumbwaiters is a fantastic song, and it's got some of the coolest lyrics on the album, and Richard Butler sings them so beautifully. She has got it in for me. Yeah, I tell you honestly. Oh, when he sings it, I feel it right here. The track She Is Mine may be the most underrated track on this album, or any Psychedelic Furs album. It's got a spacious mix, the perfect blend of instruments, and one of Richard Butler's best vocal performances. All in all, a gorgeous ballad. The track Into You Like a Train is very well named as it rocks out like a train headed towards you at full speed. So Run Down, I Want to Sleep With You, all of this and nothing. There is no let up on this LP, and the Psych Furs run through the tape with quality songs from start to finish. 1982, the band released Forever Now. This is the UK copy of the LP. The American cover is slightly different, and I think not as cool. This album was produced by legendary producer Todd Rundgren. Todd was not only the producer, but he also played an awful lot of instruments in the studio, adding to but not muddying the band's sound. This is yet another Psychedelic Furs album packed with great songs. President Gas kicks off the album with a really cool track, but my favorite track on the album is Love My Way, one of the greatest tracks of the 1980s. Yeah, you heard me. It might even be top 10 in my favorite 80s songs. The production is outstanding. Todd really outdid himself. And yes, that's the legendary team of Flo and Eddie that you hear on backing vocals. Flo and Eddie had already worked as backing vocalists with Mark Bolan and Frank Zappa, and the band didn't want much to do with them because they were seen as part of the music establishment. But Flo and Eddie on backing vocals was just one more idea shoved down the band's throat by Todd Rundgren that wound up working out brilliantly. The song Run and Run, one of my favorites. I fall in love with Richard Butler's voice and its breathy brilliance all over again on this track. The song Merry-Go-Round, come on. When Richard Butler sings, "Oh, and yeah, I want you. Oh, and yeah, I want you." It's everything. That said, don't sleep on side 2. The song You and I, sometimes called Only You and I, has such a dark, sensuous sound with outstanding production. And the track Goodbye has some of the best synth work on this entire album. This album, for me, was a bold step forward for the band and showed flashes of the polished production that was to come. In 1984, the band released Mirror Moves. This album was produced by Keith Forsey. You may know Keith Forsey because he wrote the song Don't You Forget About Me, which Simple Minds sang in the John Hughes film The Breakfast Club. You may also know Keith Forsey as the one who produced all those brilliant Billy Idol albums in the 80s. The band is down to a 3-piece here, but you can't tell from the sound of this album because it is a very thick sound. This LP really ambushes you with how good it is. It sort of sneaks up on you. At first glance, it's their dance album, for lack of a better term. Undeniable hits such as The Ghost in You and Heaven rub shoulders with offbeat tracks such as Here Come Cowboys, My Time, and Alice's House. The Ghost in You is their best song that you think you don't know, but will instantly recognize. Inside you the time moves and she don't fade. The ghost in you, she don't fade. Richard Butler is one of the most underrated lyricists ever. I love lyrics that want you to meet them halfway and allow you as the listener to fill in the blanks. Butler's lyrics are perfectly succinct, yet wildly elliptical. And from Arthur Lee to Frank Black, all of my favorite songwriters do that. The track Heaven is one of the prettiest songs about impending nuclear destruction that I've ever heard, and the song Heartbeat is my favorite track on the LP. Richard's delicious delivery on this song is stellar. He almost speak-sings it in a classic Hollywood movie style. I don't know why, but on the final line, he always reminds me of Eddie Grant in Electric Avenue. When the music goes down! Just me? Boys! I don't know where that comes from. With side 1's collection of should-have been hits and side 2's effective mood pieces, this album makes for a very satisfying listen. To see the rest of this week's episode, please join my Patreon at patreon.com/popculturegraveyard or click above for more free content.